time, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Um, Welcome, everybody, to the first of the 4 webinars in Women's Advocates September webinar series. My name is Mary Beth Becker-Loth. I am a crisis and resource advocate here at Women's Advocates. If you have attended any of our webinars in the past, these first 2 screens are going to look pretty similar to you. So yeah, as we're getting started, just feel free to put in the chat to all panelists and attendees what your name and position and organizational name, possibly city and state, is. Make sure you're putting it to all panelists and attendees. And also, if you have any specific questions or things that you would like us to address in this webinar, go ahead and add that either in the chat or the Q&A section. We will get to those as best we can. All right, so just thank you all for being here. Again, this is going to be one of those more familiar screens to folks who are coming to us again. But for those of you, whoops, sorry about that. For those of you who are new, I want to begin by just sort of taking a deep breath. Make sure you're breathing through your belly. You can use the graphic on the screen as a guide, and just tune into the present moment and ground yourselves. A lot of trauma, domestic violence, other forms of violence, those can be really difficult to talk about, even just to attend a computer webinar for. So make sure you're doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you are feeling at all moved by what's going on here in the webinar today. Many people experience trauma, so some of you might be differently impacted by this content. Again, also, I want to name that all violence is interconnected, and police violence against Black people and Indigenous people of color needs to be a part of these conversations as well. We really need to understand as a movement how domestic violence can impact Black and Indigenous survivors of color in general, and especially those who've experienced police violence or gun violence at the hands of their abusers. As we are doing our advocacy work, it is so important to understand and incorporate racial justice in our work. For now, there's a link on this webinar page to some links and blog articles discussing the intersection of racial justice and domestic violence. You can take a look at that in a little bit. And then lastly, just throughout the webinar, there's going to be a handful of polls to promote some engagement and conversation. And to start us off, I think it's going to be helpful if we all self-report our current knowledge about financial abuse and domestic violence. So I'm going to broadcast a poll here. Go ahead and just describe your current knowledge level about financial abuse. All right, so far everybody, seems like we've got some knowledge. I'll leave it up for a little bit longer. All right, so it looks like everybody, we're kind of between some knowledge and pretty comfortable with the knowledge of the topic. All right, so let's move on then. All right, let's get into it. I'm going to keep this pretty brief because our focus is on financial abuse, but this is Women's Advocates. We are the first domestic violence shelter in the nation. We've been around since 1972, and over the last couple of decades, we've learned a lot about domestic violence. We've expanded our shelter into 3 Victorian homes in St. Paul, Minnesota. All of those homes are interconnected by little links. And our mission is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. We provide prevention and education resources. We provide shelter to about 50 women and children every day, as well as advocacy and support programs and a housing program to help survivors find and maintain safe, sustainable, affordable housing for themselves and their children. Now that you all know a little bit more about us, I would love to learn a little bit about you. So I'm going to launch another poll here right off the bat. You can describe your role in the community. What do you do? What is your connection to this work? And if we're not covering you here in any of the poll options, feel free to answer it in the chat. If you're not quite finding a role or a designation that works for you, go ahead and just put that in the chat. I'd love to see what everybody's connection to this movement is. I also think we have a lot of students, or a couple of students at least, in the webinar. All right, a couple more seconds here before I end the poll. All right. So it looks like most folks fit into the domestic violence and sexual violence advocate position. All right, and then we've got a student in the chat getting field experience hours. We love those CEUs. All right. So let's go. Now we're gonna, before we really get into it, we're gonna start with some definitions. The first is the definition of domestic violence. There are a lot of different definitions here depending on whether you're talking just the general advocacy definition or legally the definition of domestic violence. There are a lot of different terms, so I wanna make sure we're all on the same page here. This definition that you see on your screens here is the definition of domestic violence that we're going to be working with today. It isn't necessarily the legal definition to qualify for a protective order, though. That can be different. So our definition today for domestic violence is an intentional and systematic pattern of physical and psychological abuse, threats, intimidation, isolation, or economic coercion used by one person to exert power and control over another person in the context of a dating, family, or household relationship. This definition really helps us understand the scope of domestic violence and the diversity of tactics that are used in an abusive relationship. And the goal, which is always to gain power and control over another person. I'm putting sexual violence in here too with that definition. But the component that makes domestic violence different from violence that you experience that's perpetrated by a stranger is the close, intimate relationship. Is the fact that the violence and the pain that's being caused is being caused by somebody who claims that they love you and care about you, whether it is a former partner, a current spouse, a parent, grandparent, uncle, roommate, cousin, somebody you live with. That adds a layer of complexity, and that person holds a unique power to hurt you in a way that a stranger never could. So that's why I really wanted to nail down that definition of domestic violence there. Domestic violence is also maintained by societal and cultural attitudes, institutions, and laws which are not consistent in naming this violence as wrong. So the idea that domestic and sexual violence both are terrible crimes and terrible experiences that our culture and our society and our laws don't necessarily condemn strongly enough. All right, so now that we have definitions here, let's talk about financial abuse. Financial abuse is one of many forms of domestic violence. If you've been at a webinar with women's advocates before, you've probably seen the power and control wheel, which includes all of the different forms of domestic violence. No form is worse than another, and multiple forms of domestic violence can be used in a day, and a lifetime, or just once. So we're here at the financial abuse section. That's where we're going to spend our time today. But again, it's one of many forms of domestic violence. You can have verbal violence, physical, emotional, reproductive coercion, spiritual abuse. The list goes on. And financial abuse is just one of the forms that we're going to be talking about and spending our most time on today. So I guess just put in the chat. We don't have a poll question specifically for it, but just put in the chat, what do you most associate with the term financial abuse? I just want to get kind of an understanding of where everybody, like what we think of when we think of financial abuse. I'm sorry about that. Let's go ahead and just put that in the chat. And yes, Julie, we are going to share the slides. There's going to be an email that you'll get with a link to the slides. Okay, yes. Katie says withholding money from someone to control them. Yes, that is definitely something that we associate with financial abuse. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of using money as a form of control, for sure. Yeah, we know abuse is all about power and control. I guess let's just take a brief look. This is a quick 30-second video from the Allstate Foundation about financial abuse. Let's take a look. All right, so that is the Allstate Foundation's video. Oh no, I'm so sorry. There's no sound. Okay. Shoot, I'm sorry about that, folks. Let's try that again. Can you guys hear it now? Oh no. Okay. So we're having technical difficulties with that. I am so sorry. All right. That is just, we'll send you a link to some slides, a link to our presentation after this webinar, and you can access that. But we'll just move on real quick because there's actually a lot more in here. Again, sorry about that. You can find that in our PDF or our link to the slides that we'll send out at the end of this webinar. So some definitions of financial or economic abuse. When an abuser takes control of or limits access to assets or limits the current or future earning potential of a victim as a form of power and control. Again, that power and control is huge here. It's also, economic abuse is also a process by which the abuser separates the victim survivor from their own resources, rights, and choices. The ability to choose where they spend their money, whether they spend their money. Economic abuse isolates the victim financially and creates a forced dependency for the victim as well as other family members that might be staying in the same household. That forced dependency of economic abuse makes it harder for victims to leave the relationship. So you see a lot of, it becomes harder to leave, right? When there's economic abuse involved, exactly like not allowing somebody to work, creating that forced dependency, creating a situation where the abuser is the only person who is allowed to make money or the only person who's allowed to handle the money. That creates a system by which the victim is dependent on the abuser for survival, for economic survival, which makes it harder to leave. When you don't have your own assets, you don't have your own money, it's so much harder to build a financially stable life without that person. So forms of economic abuse, there are two kind of main big ones that everything else is sort of a little subset of. There are two categories basically. Employment-related abuse, which is the abuser preventing a victim from earning money, from making a living. So keeping the victim from attending a job, like hiding car keys the night before an interview, demanding that the victim quits their job if they have one, because the abuser is the only person who's allowed to have a job or allowed to make money, or, oh no, you quit your job, I'll take care of you. Sabotaging attempts to look for jobs or attend job interviews, like hiding the keys, and stalking or harassing the victim at work. Those are all, anything work related goes into the category of employment related abuse. Then you also have coerced debt, which is a behavior that we see a lot for financial abuse in financially abusive and exploitive relationships, where the abuser forces non-consensual credit-related transactions. So the abuser will apply for credit cards, loans, or open accounts with stores or other credit card accounts in the victim's name without their knowledge or consent. So it really is a way to completely screw up the victim's credit score, or for the abuser to enrich themselves if they don't have very good credit. Another example of coerced debt is forcing the victim to obtain loans or sign financial documents. The use of threats to convince victims to use their credit card or take on more credit. Refinancing a mortgage or a car loan without a victim's knowledge. Taking shared assets in any way and changing them around without a victim's knowledge. Those are all forms of coerced debt, all forms of economic abuse. So let's take a look here. Yeah, controlling credit cards and transportation absolutely are both forms of economic abuse. So I guess in what you've seen, I'm going to launch a poll here where you can describe what forms of economic or financial abuse have you encountered most often in your work? Do you see more coerced debt, more employment-related abuse? Do you see neither of that? Have you not encountered financial abuse in your work? Do you work with a lot of people who have been harassed at work? Do you work for a lot of people who have experienced coerced debt? Looks like we've got a pretty even split so far, but also if you're seeing something else as a form of financial abuse, please let us know in the chat. All right, it seems like we've got a pretty even split of folks who have seen employment-related abuse versus folks who've seen coerced debt versus folks who've seen none of it. Pretty even split there. Moving on, there are more forms of economic abuse than just coerced debt or employment-related abuse. Here are a couple of others. So we see, and this can happen not just in an intimate relationship like a partnership or a marriage, but also between parents and children. Economic abuse can be really common between parents and children, between parents and children as well. Deciding when or how the victim can access or use bank accounts and credit cards, forcing a victim to withdraw ATM cards or credit cards to take out more. Demanding, the abuser sometimes will demand that the lease or the mortgage or any of the assets be in the abuser's name so that if the victim leaves, they don't have anything. It's a tactic to keep the victim with the abuser. There's also using checkbook, ATM card, credit cards without the victim's knowledge. So just straight up theft. And then another form of financial abuse is limiting the victim's access to benefits such as EBT or disability payments. When an abuser or an abusive person confiscates the EBT card and says, I am the only one who can hold on to this. I'm the only one who can use this. You have to ask for permission if you want to use it. If you want to get food for the kids or food for yourself, you've got to ask for it. Withholding benefits like that is a really common method of financial abuse. Basically, the common factor that we see here in financial abuse is that the victim's money is not their own anymore. They don't have access to their own money or to their they don't have the ability to make their own financial decisions. Here are some other little factoids about financial abuse. Financial abuse is the most common form of domestic violence or of a domestic abuse that is experienced, but it's experienced by between 94 and 99% of domestic violence victim survivors. So it is an incredibly common tactic used by abusers and experienced by victims. Domestic violence causes victim survivors to lose 8 million days of paid work each year, causes 21 to 60% of survivors to lose their jobs. It takes a huge economic toll on victim survivors. Financial abuse is it's the most common, and it's also one of the most difficult because it creates a situation where victim survivors just aren't able to leave. All right. So when we think about financial abuse, we want to know why it matters. First, because it prevents victim survivors from leaving. Money is one of the most common reasons why people stay in abusive relationships. On average, in the United States, it takes a victim survivor of abuse 7 or 8 attempts to leave an abusive relationship permanently. In our experience here at Women's Advocates, finances are one of the top reasons that a survivor stays in or returns to an abusive relationship. So finances are a huge barrier for a lot of victim survivors. Financial instability prevents long-term safety and independence. Even without experiencing financial abuse, victim survivors who leave an abusive relationship find themselves struggling to afford safe housing, utilities, food, childcare, and healthcare for themselves and their kids on a single income. And then you add to that the burden of coerced debt in financial abuse, of the burden of bad credit, which prevents access to safe housing or approval for future loans, as well as the lack of assets if the abusers kept everything in their name. And then you've got a whole list of barriers that prevent a victim survivor from achieving self-sufficiency. You also Financial abuse is also important because we need to see the interconnectedness here of relationship abuse and the landlord and rent crisis. Domestic violence is a huge reason why people are evicted from their homes. Landlords will often evict folks who have had the cops called on them due to domestic violence. That is mostly illegal now, but it still happens. Also, when rent is skyrocketing everywhere, it's hard to afford a one-bedroom apartment on a single income or on two incomes, let alone a single income for someone who's leaving an abusive relationship. You add to that the fact that it gets more and more expensive to rent or to buy a home if you have children involved. There's a huge intersection there. And then you also have it's really important to talk about financial abuse because of the racial considerations. The forced lack of generational wealth in communities of color means a smaller financial support network for survivors who are Black or Indigenous people of color. There are survivors that can rely on financial support from family and friends when they leave an abusive relationship. That's great when your family and friends also have wealth. When you have that generational wealth to fall back on and are able to ask a supportive network of family and friends for financial assistance. But for Black and Indigenous and Latinx survivors of domestic violence, there's a forced lack of generational wealth there. So those particular survivors can't necessarily ask family or friends for financial support because the generational wealth has been stolen. Okay, so as advocates, what can we do about financial abuse? There are a couple of things here that we can do. The big ones that I want to really stress to people are to lobby representatives for affordable housing and lower rent, for a higher minimum wage, for increases to government benefits and government coverage, and coverage of benefits, because we need to be breaking more barriers for folks. We need to have an abundance of affordable housing to eliminate the deadly impact of financial abuse. We have to have a higher minimum wage to eliminate the impacts of financial abuse. We have to make it easier for people to qualify for benefits, and we have to make those benefits more substantial to eliminate the impact of financial abuse. On an organizational basis, on an organizational level, advocates can remove barriers to financial stability. Consider some micro grants. Consider giving directly to survivors, giving money directly to survivors. Remove those barriers. Take an organizational inventory and figure out, when you're working with survivors, where do they tend to hit a wall when it comes to financial security? Is there a lack of affordable childcare preventing them from working a regular schedule? Can they not afford the bus fare or the gas to get from job interview to job interview? Figure out in your organization kind of where the wheels fall off, and then see what you can do, what room you have in your budget to get those wheels back on again. Maybe partner with childcare programs, maybe offer transportation to and from job interviews, maybe just give money directly to survivors. all of this removes barriers to financial independence and financial stability, which in turn makes it easier for survivors to create sustained safety for themselves, reducing the chances that they'll end back up in an abusive relationship out of financial necessity. And then lastly, educate. So work on financial literacy for victim survivors, work on financial safety planning, which we'll get to later on in the webinar. I mentioned financial literacy classes, like kind of toward the end here, for a couple of reasons. One is because financial literacy classes really only go so far. You can take 7 different financial literacy classes. You can know all there is to know about saving and budgeting and how to keep your money safe. But when you don't have money to begin with, it's impossible to do anything with that knowledge, right? Like, you can't do anything. You can't budget if you don't have the money to budget. You can only do so much without going to the root of the problem, which is capitalism and the growing wealth gap. It's kind of discouraging, but often the problem isn't that victim survivors don't know what to do with their money. Victim survivors are some of the most financially creative people I've ever met. Like, they know how to make $20 feed 6 people for 8 days. It's amazing. It's not that they don't know how to stretch their money or what to do with their money. It's that there isn't enough money to sustain life on a single income. We know that rent is rising, that the cost of living is rising, but wages are staying the same and government benefits are getting cut. Our current economic system is just not enough. It's actively preventing victim survivors from leaving their abusers because it makes it nearly impossible to survive on a single income. So I spend a lot of time talking about lobbying your representatives because as advocates, it is so important for us to levy our organizational power by contacting our local reps and pushing for these systemic changes, because societally, we really need to break down as many barriers as possible so that survivors can afford to leave. In safety planning, we talk about the high cost of leaving as, like, when somebody leaves an abusive relationship, that's the time where they're most vulnerable to, where the risk of lethal interaction with their abuser is highest. But there's also, like, a literal high financial cost of leaving. You have to find everything. You have to make everything in your life work on a single income. And it's just barely possible. So it's really important as advocates that we are lobbying our representatives, that we're doing as much as we can as organizations to provide for survivors while they are working with us, because survivors are doing everything they can. It's just the capitalism, really. All right, so let's talk about financial safety planning, which is the reason that a lot of you are here. The first step in safety planning, if you are working with somebody who you find out has been experiencing financial abuse, or whose abuser is stealing from them or withholding their paychecks or benefits, first thing is seek help from a trained domestic violence advocate. And I assume that some of you are trained domestic violence advocates, so step 1 is done. Just some tips while you're safety planning with folks. Survivors should just avoid using credit or debit cards if possible. They're really easy for an abuser to track, especially if there is a joint bank account involved. Try to keep cash transactions as much as possible. Also make sure that the victim survivor can access their personal and financial records. Make sure that they have copies of their bank statements, of their tax information, of their social security cards, all of that. Make sure it's in a safe location. Figure out if you as the advocate or as the advocacy program can store those records for the survivor. Because a lot of times survivors don't have trusted friends or family members who have a safe and stable enough place to just keep that information safe. Also, when you are planning to leave a financially abusive relationship, make sure that you're compiling an emergency box. So you have all of the copies of your family's important financial records and documents in one place. That can be with you on your person, that can be with the organization, that can be with a trusted friend or family member. And just make sure that you also have copies of all of your keys, all of your extra money, phone numbers, all of that. Just keep it in a safe place. Make sure that if you are working with a survivor who is, a survivor who is doing a lot of online research on financial independence, just make sure that they're doing it either on a computer in your program that's not going home with them, or make sure the browsing history is private. We know it's 2020. We know that abusers can track people's internet usage, can track people's credit card statement history, transaction history. So just make sure you are working with the survivor to ensure their privacy. It's important when you're planning to leave a financially abusive relationship to take a financial inventory. If you have assets or liabilities, list them all out. Figure out how much money you owe, figure out how much money you have. That way you can anticipate surprises. If new spending pops up unexpectedly, you can keep an eye on it. Figure out how to get a copy of your credit report. You can obtain a free copy of your credit report every 12 months with the government. So make sure, if you're an advocate, make sure that survivors are doing that. It might be helpful when you're doing an assessment to say, hey, do you know what your credit score is? Because a lot of times survivors might not. They might not know they have a credit score. Definitely make sure that the survivors you're working with have access to their credit information so that they're not surprised later on. Also, for survivors, if the abuser does control the money, just look for ways to find out more information about their income. Abusers oftentimes will not talk about their financial information to their victim. They're withholding that information because information is power. And so if there are ways to go to the public records office with the survivor to help look up their partner's income, to potentially see exactly where they are, if there are any surprise debts or any surprise properties that they didn't know about. Investigate where and when you can to figure out what the abuser's real financial situation is. And then lastly, if you're considering leaving, or if a survivor you're working with is considering leaving an abuser, just make sure you're calculating and budgeting ahead of time. I know budgeting only gets you so far when the money is not even there to budget. But just calculate what it would cost for you to live on your own, figure out what your expenses are, and start to set aside your money in a safe place. It sounds really easy to do when you say it like that, right? Like, oh, just budget, just write down all your expenses and then squirrel away your cash when you can. That is so much easier said than done. There are a lot of reasons why a person just wouldn't be able to budget in the first place. But it is worth saying, just to keep, if you have money, keep it in a safe place and start storing it away for the future. But that isn't the only solution. All right, so there are a couple of things here about safety planning during the coronavirus pandemic, financial and otherwise. Um, Safety planning looks a little bit different now because our focus is less on getting survivors safely to shelter and more on making sure that survivors are okay staying with their abuser for a while. COVID has had a wild effect on shelter intake and capacity. Shelters are a lot more full. Um, there are a lot of shelters that have had to shut down completely. So shelter space is really, really limited lately because of the pandemic. And that means there are less opportunities for victim survivors to leave abusive situations and come into shelter. So the safety planning that we're doing, or that I'm seeing a lot in my work now, is less on how to help somebody leave and more on making sure they're taking care of themselves long enough to get through this time. Making sure they're emotionally safe while they're staying. Because unfortunately, due to this pandemic, a lot of people who have ordinarily left their abusers by now are unable to. And a lot of times that is for reasons of financial abuse. There's less money to go around. The abuser or the victim could have been laid off. And a lot of people are finding themselves relying on really, really reduced incomes to make ends meet, which makes it even harder to leave if you're in an abusive relationship. So here's some information about how to use safety planning resources. As you're safety planning, the safety plan should be individualized to each survivor. Every survivor is different. Everybody's experiences are different. Different things that are helpful to some survivors are going to be just completely off base for others. Because domestic violence is so diverse and varied in its approaches and in the way it affects people. So the same safety plan is not going to work for two different survivors. Safety plans should address the survivor's specific fears and concerns. They should be realistic and practical for the survivor's situation. So saying, oh, just keep your extra money with your mom might be great for some folks. It might be a really realistic part of somebody's safety plan, but for everybody, no, it's not going to be realistic or practical for them to A, have extra money, and B, keep it with someone. So just make sure that it's realistic for the survivor's situation. Safety plans should also always be open to revisions. They are working documents. They are not set in stone. They are not giant tablets that are etched upon forever. Safety plans get to be changed and they get to be revisited frequently. Every time a new situation happens, you should pull out that safety plan with the survivor and say, okay, well, we've never seen this before. How do you want to take care of yourself during it? Safety plans should also be shared. Make sure that somebody else, not just the survivor and not just you, the advocate, knows what's on them. Keep it confidential, keep it private, but also make sure that there is one other person who can check in with the survivor on how the safety plan is going. The important thing about a safety plan is that somebody else knows about it and can help you with it. Also make sure, I'm just going to hammer this home again, make sure you are enforcing for the survivor their agency and choice in this process. You ask the survivor, what are you most worried about? What do you want to do about what you are most worried about? How do you want to proceed? Always be leaving it up to the survivor, because domestic violence is one of those things that completely takes away your agency as a person. And as advocates, we have a responsibility to reinforce and reassert a survivor's agency and independence as a fully autonomous person as often as possible. All right. So financial empowerment is also really crucial for survivors, for anybody who is experiencing financial abuse. Um, there are a couple of things that you can do to to empower survivors financially. Some of those are trainings and classes. There are a couple of links here to an economic empowerment program sponsored by the Florida Coalition for Domestic Violence. There's also the Allstate Foundation, which we saw in that video earlier that I couldn't get up for you, I couldn't make hearable for you all. But they have modules for both survivors and advocates about financial empowerment, financial independence. They have a whole bunch of modules for survivors on credit, on loans, on mortgages, on taxes. Just a really great list of classes and resources for both survivors and advocates. Allstate is the organization that used to do, I mean, you know them because they sell insurance, but they also have the Purple Purse Foundation's foundation program for domestic violence. You may have heard of them. They now are just called the Allstate Foundation, and they provide a whole bunch of educational modules. Also, for financial empowerment, consider direct giving money directly to survivors, trusting domestic violence survivors with the ability to know what they want to spend money on, what they need to spend money on, and trusting them to spend the money that you give them the way that they need it spent. Consider connecting survivors with mutual aid networks. Recently, in the past couple of months, we've seen a real insurgence of mutual aid networks popping up all over the country in response to the police brutality recently, in response to continued work for Black liberation. We've seen a lot of mutual aid networks pop up recently all over the country that are just people helping other people. And if you can connect survivors to those mutual aid networks, they might find some more support and assistance that wouldn't ever necessarily come from a nonprofit. Also, consider whether your organization has the budget or the ability to solicit micro grants or micro loans, just small amounts of money either given or borrowed to survivors to spend on immediate needs or continuing education or emergency housing. Also, consider direct cash payments. Consider just giving money directly, like I said, to survivors and trusting that they know what they need to spend their money on. That's financial empowerment, is giving that choice back, is reasserting to the survivor, you are a grown person who has the ability and the right to decide how they want to spend their money. Here is a list of specific resources related to financial abuse. We have the Allstate Foundation, the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, the National Network to End Domestic Violence Financial Abuse Fact Sheet, and some resources from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We also here have a safety planning smorgasbord here for emotional safety plannings, physical safety planning. These are all self-care and emotional safety planning because we need to go beyond physical safety here when we're working with domestic violence survivors. There are a couple of different options here, a couple different templates organized for different folks, and you can find these on our website as well. I also want to mention that Women's Advocates has a live chat feature. You can chat with us 24/7. You can go to our website, and right at the top of the page, we have a little link in the head bar where you can chat live with an advocate, and you can chat with them about anything, about financial abuse, financial safety planning, if you just need emotional support. If you're an advocate working with survivors, make sure and let them know that somebody's always here to chat with them if they can't necessarily make it to a phone. All right, and finally, go ahead and connect with us. We have our website here. You can find us on social media. You can register for all of our September webinars. And we also have a 24-hour crisis line and an outreach email. You can email outreach@wadvocates.org to request a certificate of attendance for this webinar. And also you can register for all of our September webinars. Here, let me put in a couple of links here. Let's see. There we go. And there's a link to your post-webinar survey. Feel free to fill that out completely. This is my first webinar with Women's Advocates. This is my first solo webinar. So please, please, please use the post-webinar survey so I can learn a little bit more, figure out how best to make this work for folks. Again, send an email to the outreach account requesting a certificate of attendance for our financial abuse webinar. We will get that back to you as soon as possible. And that should be it. Yeah, that's it. So thank you all so much for being here tonight, for taking some time out of your evening to talk about financial abuse. It is not a super fun topic, so thank you so much for being here. And please make sure to take care of yourselves in the meantime. Drink some water, take some deep breaths, do some journaling, take care of yourselves. So that is all for our webinar. Again, please, please, please fill out that survey and send an email to outreach requesting a certificate of attendance. And yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen with you all. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm gonna stop recording and call it good. If you need anything at all, you can go ahead and contact us. Go ahead and email for links to the presentation, but this webinar is over.